What is up, my YouTubian nation? This is Barn on 11970, and as always, I thank you guys for taking the time to watch my channel. Alright guys, this little bit of information that I'm going to give is going to be kind of basic for some that have been here for a while. So if you've been researching this stuff for the past couple of years, you pretty much already know about what I'm going to talk about. So you may want to skip this video just in case, unless you think you might learn something additional that you weren't sure of or didn't know. This is primarily going to be because I get a lot of newer people, especially recently. I get a lot of emails of people asking me questions, and I thought I would go over this in greater detail to kind of give people a general idea of why we're being lied to, why our wealth is being stolen, and how it basically happened. Basically, the way banks were created, the specific date of when it happened is irrelevant, so I don't have the specific date. Obviously, I don't think anybody does, but again, that's irrelevant. But at a certain point, it actually originated in China, where they were trying to find a way to be able to pay soldiers and not have them carry into battle gold and silver coins, which can be heavy. So they were paying with paper at that time. But the difference between then and the banks that came a little bit later is the currency that they were using, their paper, was actually backed by an even amount of gold. So that's where it was different when it originated. But that's around, I think it was around, roughly around the 13th century, 14th century, when China started doing this. About 100 or 200 years later, over in England, that's where the current banking system originated from. And what they found is, again, all nations, they start out with physical gold and silver. This is a practice throughout history that it dates back all the way back to the Egyptians. Now, if you think about gold and silver coins, they are heavy, they are bulky, so they're not as easy to move around, especially back in those days where they didn't have pants with pockets, so they had pouches. Obviously, it was a lot easier to steal them. If you had to make a large purchase, they got very heavy. It wasn't convenient. So what they created were vaults, which at the time, it was basically to protect your gold and silver from being stolen. I mean, they didn't have doors with locks. A lot of buildings didn't even have windows. So to protect your investment, your wealth, they had storage facilities, basically, where wealthier people would protect your gold and they would protect your silver or whatever wealth they had. And obviously, you would pay a fee for this. Now, what they did was they issued you a receipt. I'm just using a blank piece of paper just to show this. That would say, let's say, for example, you had 10 gold pieces. They would write on a receipt. Now, I don't know exactly what they wrote, obviously. I wasn't there. But let's just say, for example, they wrote a receipt of 10 gold pieces. What they started finding out was, as people were using and depositing their gold and silver into these vaults, the people started trading these certificates, these basically IOUs, and they weren't going back to the vaults to retrieve their gold. So basically what happened was, they really realized that as long as everybody didn't come at the same time, or large amounts of people didn't come at the same time to get their gold or their silver, and they kept trading these certificates, well, they could write as many of these as they wanted, and they necessarily did not have to have the same amount of gold. So it originally started out, if they had these 10 gold pieces, they wrote a certificate for 10 gold pieces. After a while, they started writing several of these, even when somebody didn't come and deposit any gold. So they realized that they could scam the people and profit from them. And what happened is, people would come in and they would try and get a loan. Now, instead of going into the vault and giving them either gold, silver, copper, whatever, they were giving these certificates, which was nothing more than a promise to give this value. And the people would use it for whatever reason that they borrowed it from. Now, here's the kicker. They had to repay that loan plus interest. Now, they couldn't pay it back in these notes. They had to pay it back with actual real money, gold and silver. So that's where the scams started, where banks would give out pieces of paper that were backed by not as much gold as originally placed into the banks, lending them out to people that they had to repay back with real money plus interest. And this is where all banks and all countries around the world and throughout history have ultimately ended up with the destruction of their currency, because there's a pattern. All countries start out basically with gold, silver, copper. There might be variations from here and there, but generally, since the days of the Egyptians and the Roman Empire, they used gold and silver and copper as primarily for their coins. Back in the days of the Roman Empire, they didn't issue paper currency, but what they did was to create a fiat currency, which basically a fiat currency means that it is no longer backed by anything other than the promise from the government. So if the government says, like for example, this piece of paper, if the government said that had value, it automatically had value, even if it was backed by nothing. Now, back in the days of the Roman Empire, when they had gold or silver coins, they guaranteed the silver content, for example, in their coins to be 80% pure silver. That was guaranteed by the government. The Roman Empire was the first government to ever guarantee the quantity of the metal in their coin. Over time, it started getting harder and harder to acquire their precious metals, because obviously you have to find them, you have to dig them out of the ground, you have to extract metals. It's not an easy process. It takes man energy, man power. And as they expanded the Roman Empire, it took longer distances and you needed more people. Like, you had to take certain amount of Roman armies to be in the areas that they conquer. There had to be politicians, there had to be money that had to be created. So the further they expanded, the more money it cost to be able to keep that going. So they needed more and more metal. And obviously, at a certain point, it got more and more difficult because they didn't have the technology to extract and find deeper layers of metal like we can today. So the way they got around it and the way they created a fiat currency was they started secretly taking out the amount of metal content in the coins. So at one point it went from 80 to 70 to maybe 60, to the point where when the quote unquote barbarians ended up overthrowing part of the Roman Empire, there was approximately about 20% of the actual silver, even though it was still guaranteed to be 80%. So they were trying to cheat the people by stealing the wealth from the money, and ultimately ended up to the destruction of at least part of the Roman Empire. It split in two at that point, but ultimately the other side fell as well. But this is where current banking systems in current countries are scamming you. So if you've never heard of this before, it's because the media and your schools will never educate you with these things. So what they do is they start out, like, even if you look at the history of the United States of America Corporation, it started out with gold and silver coins. If you look at the currency of the money, even before we became an official country, all the coins were gold and silver. Now, of course, again, it's very bulky, it's very inconvenient, so they try and use convenience to get people to follow a certain pattern. So they started backing their currency up with gold certificates. Again, like the dollar bills we see today. The difference is, back then, they were backed by gold. So you would go to a bank, you would deposit your gold or your silver into the bank, they would issue you these reserve notes that had gold backed up, which meant if you had a $20 gold certificate, or $20 bill if you wanted to call it that at the time, you could go to the bank and get your $20 worth of gold. They did this for decades, and people got used to, instead of trading with gold and silver coins, they started more and more frequently using the paper currency because it's just more convenient. You can have 1,000 gold pieces in one certificate instead of carrying around 1,000 actual pieces of gold. So it was definitely more convenient to have the paper notes. After a certain point, and they realized how they could scam the people, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio where they print for every piece of paper that they print, they had maybe 1/4 ounce, 1 ounce, or whatever amount of gold. They started printing, again, more pieces of paper than actual gold. But because there was still a gold standard, there was a limit to how much they could print as far as the money is concerned. After 1933, when the gold got confiscated and gold was illegal, they took basically the United States off the gold standard. So then you'll see, like, for example, if you had like a 1920 $20 gold certificate, the only difference is it went from a gold certificate to a silver certificate. which meant that it was a cheaper metal, less value. They could ultimately print more. Well, what happened if you fast forward to 1971? Richard Nixon convinced the entire world to go on a system where it was no longer backed by gold or any precious metals, and it became what is called a fiat currency, F-I-A-T. That, like I said, basically means that your money no longer has any kind of value based and backing it up. So when you had gold and silver backing up your currency, it took man hours, it took energy, it took effort to be able to pull that out of the ground. Gold and silver was not finite. There's not an infinite amount of gold and silver. So it was making countries be fiscally responsible. But you notice after any war, they have to spend lots of money to be able to create jobs, to be able to manufacture weapons, to be able to build the tanks. And once the war is over, all that money they need to borrow to be able to repair the damage, like what had happened in Europe over in World War II. So they borrow lots of money. Now, obviously, if they didn't have the gold to back it up, that would issue a problem with how much money they could make. So finding the way to go around the system is basically by going from a gold certificate to a certificate that says silver certificate to what we see in current day when it just says Federal Reserve Note. What that means is it's no longer backed by anything, which means they don't have to have a certain amount of gold or a certain amount of any kind of other material to be able to print these pieces of paper. And that meant they could print at will. And that's why, especially as you see now, they're printing billions of dollars a month just to keep it alive. Now, if you research history, any nation that has ever had a fiat currency, where again, it's only backed by the fact that the government says it has value, throughout recorded history, fiat currencies have a 100% failure rate with an average lifespan of 40 years. Now, that doesn't mean 40 years comes up and it automatically is done. I mean, the average lifespan of a human being is about 65 years old. That doesn't mean everybody dies at 65. Some live until they're 20, some live until they're 100. So it's the same thing with these currencies. But if you look at the world, in 1971, we were taken off the gold standard everywhere. 40 years into the future is 2011, as we saw how high that the prices of gold and silver were getting. Is it any coincidence now, all of a sudden, that they have to print so much money and that prices are getting so much higher? It's not that the prices are getting higher. It's the fact that you need more of that money, more of that fiat system, to be able to purchase the very same things that you had to buy in the past. And you need more of it because every time they print more, it loses its value. So that's where the scam lies, and this is why it cannot last forever. And if you research history, when a fiat currency collapses, 99 out of 100 times, they go back again to the gold and silver standard. They restart. So I understand people are disappointed in the way currently the gold and silver is headed. To me, it is not the real value that you're seeing because they are manipulating the paper price to scare people away from it and thinking that these pieces of paper, which are backed by nothing, have value. Well, the end game is coming for the dollar and all the fiat systems around the world. And that's why you're seeing countries like China, the Soviet Union, Germany, and all these other countries storing up gold. They're loving these prices because it is allowing their countries to store real wealth. So when we finally lose the confidence in the dollar and the world currencies, they will be able to reset and use gold again as the standard for the financial ability to be able to create money again. And that's the difference between currency and money. The system that we have right now is no longer money. It's a currency. It's not backed by anything. It has no intrinsical value. In other words, if you have 10 ounces of gold in this hand and 100 ounces of gold in this hand, well, obviously the 100 ounces of gold is worth more because you need more of it. But if you have a $1 bill here and a $1,000 bill here, there's no difference other than the numbers that they print on them. And since it's backed by nothing, that's the scam. So the way they trick people by basically when you work you are not getting paid cash most of the time, and you're definitely not being paid gold and silver. Most of the time, you either have a direct deposit or they hand you a check, which means they're handing you nothing. You deposit that into a bank where you're literally giving it back to the banks and the Federal Reserve System. It's technically not yours once you give it to a bank. They just don't tell you that. But if you have to borrow money or you have a loan, they don't hand you money. They write you a check or they automatically deposit it in your account. Now, you're not getting anything of value other than a couple of digital numbers or a piece of paper that says you have such and such money. But you have to work God knows how many years to be able to create the currency plus interest to pay them back. And if you don't, they take away your property. So these kind of scams work very well until people become aware of it. And then the confidence is lost and the game is over. And that's where we're getting very near to. Because as you see, people with the help of the internet are getting this information and are educating themselves in ways they never could. So the best way to protect yourself against this inevitability is to buy and store physical gold and silver. The reason it's low right now is because they want to keep people away from that. They want to keep this game going as long as they can. So that 1% or that 1/10 of 1% can continue to make billions of dollars and confiscate people's homes. Why do you think so many houses are being foreclosed? And remember, when that housing market bubble crashed in 2008, the news media before 2008 was trying to convince everybody that the economy's fine, it's recovering, and there's going to be no problems, and everything dropped. And look what happened. And look how many people were given all of that free money from the mortgage companies with no credit checks needed. You could refinance your home. We'll give you tons of extra money based on the value of your home, knowing that you would not be able to pay it back. So they give you nothing but basically air and a bunch of digital numbers. And you have to work to pay off that loan plus interest. And if you don't, they take your real property. That's the scam. So if you want to continue thinking that paper has value, that's an illusion that's going to be, that curtain's going to be revealed soon. Now, obviously, we don't have a crystal ball, and we're not part of the manipulation, so we don't know when exactly that date is going to happen. But it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So if you want to be scared out of the market because you see these dips in the precious metal, then you're using emotion and not thinking about the history of the fiat nations and how 100% of the time it has failed. So you can either think that this will be the first time in history that it doesn't happen, and the dollar will just continue to go even though they have to print it more and more each time as they go, or you could realize that the game is coming near to an end. It's inevitable because the people that are in control, the professionals, are fiscally irresponsible and greedy. Well, protecting yourself by getting real gold and silver will end up ultimately store your wealth for when they have to hit the reset button. So I'm just going to leave it at that at this point. Hopefully this will give some enlightenment to some people who've never heard of this before. So if you appreciate it, please give it a thumbs up. Give us your opinion of what you think about what's going on in the world, and let us know what you think. I'm getting gold and silver because I'm protecting myself from that inevitability. If it takes a year or two, if it takes 5 years, that's fine. If you're prepared, it's like insurance. You're glad you have it when you need it. Most people, they'll listen to the media, try and scare them into thinking that gold and silver has no value, and countries are storing up all that gold. There's a reason for it, and it's definitely not Ben Bernanke's tradition. Thanks for watching. Hope you learned something. Peace.